I hate sanding, but you have to do it. Even if you use hand planes to surface your material, sometimes you just can't avoid sanding. But unlike mastering hand planes, sanding is pretty easy and it takes very little skill or practice. Just takes a little time and a dust mask. Sure, there's a few rules, but you'll have them down pretty quickly. So what kind of sander do you want to buy? Well, there's a belt sander out there, but that's really a carpenter's tool, or maybe it's a paint removal tool. That's what I've used it for. However, it hogs off a lot of material and really quickly. You can mess things up in just seconds. You also find pad sanders, which are the little tiny ones with the square face on them. Those really aren't aggressive enough for the work that we're going to be doing in the cabinet shop. They're great for getting into little corners, but that's really the only time you'd want to use them. And they just vibrate back and forth. A random orbit sander, on the other hand, spins really rapidly, this plate here, but then it also simultaneously wiggles back and forth in an eccentric motion. And what that does is provide a balance between aggressive stock removal and a fine finish surface. Now there's a couple of different body styles available for sanders. I prefer the small sander because I can grip it with my small hands. You can also grip it with larger hands. Yes, these tools are easily used ambidextrously too, which is nice. It's the only way you can amuse yourself when you're sitting there sanding for 20 minutes. Switch back and forth, rest one arm, shake it off. Can you tell? I really hate sanding. Anyway, the nice thing about this small sander that you can grip with one hand is that they're fairly inexpensive. Most important, though, is that these 5-inch diameter discs that fit onto this sander are ubiquitous. You will find them almost everywhere. I think my local Kroger grocery store actually carries a couple grits of these. It's also nice because it's lightweight and it's small enough to get in almost all the way to corners on projects. You'll have to do a little sanding by hand to catch the actual corners, but you can get a lot of it done with a random orbit sander. So, how do you choose your random orbit sander? Like drills, they come out with new ones all the time, and you're going to be faced with a lot of choices. Frankly, we've tested them in our shop. They're all kind of the same, and they all work pretty well. Bottom line, you want to get the one that's comfortable to hold. They do come with different speeds on them, though, and this one you set the different speed back here. I have never encountered a situation where I want to drop it down to the lowest speed so that I can sand for longer. That's crazy. I'm sure there's a good reason for it, but in my shop, it pretty much stays on the fastest speed and I leave it there. I mentioned the dust collection canisters. The dust collection is pretty bad on every random orbit sander, with a couple of really high-end exceptions that you can't get at your local hardware store. Sanding creates a lot of dust, and you want to keep that out of your lungs, especially the submicron stuff. If you own a shop vacuum, spring for the upgraded vacuum filters for your vac, and buy hoses to attach it to the sander. If you don't have a shop vacuum, buy one. Okay, if you can't buy a shop vac, buy a good dust mask. The kind that is approved by NIOSH, and those are available at home centers. This is not that kind of dust mask, but I didn't want to look like Darth Vader as we were doing this. So if you're doing a lot of sanding, make sure you have a good dust mask or you have proper dust collection. And most important, everybody forgets this, is if you are using this for your dust collection, make sure you empty it regularly. It's going to fill up very quickly. One more thing to consider is the kind of sandpaper that you're going to buy. The cost of the sandpaper is going to add up very quickly if you're using this a lot. But there is very little in woodworking that's more expensive than buying cheap sandpaper. Quality stuff lasts a long time. The cheap stuff doesn't. You'll be switching it out almost immediately. I am typically going to use 3 grits in the shop. That's 100 or 120 grit for coarse sanding. Most of the time, that's the one I'm going to use because the coarse sanding takes the longest. So, point being, buy more of your lower grit material, the rougher material. My secondary sanding is going to be done with a 150 pad, which is about a medium grit. It goes pretty quickly if you did a good job with the coarse sanding. If you've created a fine series of scratches with your coarse pad, all you're doing is removing those when you move on to the medium, the 150. Create, again, a pattern of 150 scratches that erases the ones that you created with the 100 or 120. Then you're going to move up to the 220. And that's actually I might stop at 150 if I'm painting it, but if I'm putting a clear finish on it, probably going to go up to 220. And all I'm doing with the 220 is removing those 150 grit scratches, and it really doesn't take very long here. And yes, there is a proper way to sand. I know it looks really easy. You could just stick the tool on the work and move it around. But if you do it correctly, this job will go a lot faster. So I'm ready to start sanding. But first I want to think about my hand pressure. I don't want to bear down too hard on the tool. I want to let the tool do the work. I also want to keep it flat to the work. If I have a small area of tear out, I know that it's pretty hard to avoid sort of tipping your tool and just trying to hit just that little area. If you do that, you're going to create a little divot though, and you may not see it without finish on it. You'll be able to feel it if you run your hand across it afterward, but I can guarantee you once you put that finish on it and you think you're done with your project and ready to put it in your living room, you're going to see that divot. Second, don't move too quickly. If you look at manufacturer's directions, they say to move about 1 foot every 10 seconds. I think that's a little slow. I've tried to do it that slowly and I just can't. I think I probably move about 1 foot every 5 to 7 seconds, so maybe it takes me 33% more passes to get my work done, and I should slow down. But it doesn't matter, I'm still going to spend the same amount of time. So, the third thing to keep in mind is to work every surface in a consistent pattern. I go left to right, slightly overlapping my passes, and then again I do that front to back. That way I don't miss anything. Now my final pass with my 220 as I remove the last of the scratches is going to be with the grain. Most of the work, as I said before, is done with the coarse grit. And how do you know when it's time to move on? Well, when you have a consistent pattern of grit scratches. Yep, you're sanding and creating scratches in your work, which sounds antithetical to what you're trying to do. But the key is, as you move up again, is to remove the larger scratches with the successively higher grits until you can't see them anymore, even if they're still there. You also want to look at your work in a raking light, the same as when you're using a rasp and or a file, because you can actually see the dings and divots and you can see a consistent scratch pattern, and if it looks good, you know it's time to move on. At higher grits, less work, maybe half the time that I spent using the 100 or 120 grit at 150, and then half that again when I get up to my 220. And after you're done with the random orbit sander, you want to grab a sheet of sandpaper and break your edges. What that does is keep your finish in place and keeps it from breaking off on the corners, because what you have there is the meeting of two flat points, and it's really hard to keep anything on a really narrow surface like that. And for that, I use 150 grit sandpaper with just a few strokes. And now let's take a look at this in action. You can see that I came back and went front to back with a series of overlapping passes too. I'm going to follow that same pattern on all of my sanding, and that way I know I won't have missed a spot. And already, even with just the 120 grit on there, you can see what a difference it's made in the way this board looks. So just continue on through the grits, don't skip them. I know it's tempting, but you'll get done more quickly if you actually go through them. And then you're done and ready to put a finish on. You've got a great looking project.